Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my hidden gems for Week 17 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Now, after the snap that occurred this week, many of us have began to feel the imbalance that is the fantasy football landscape. And in order to counteract that, we're going to go ahead and find 6 hidden gems across the entire fantasy football landscape on different teams from different timelines, and go ahead and reassemble the fantasy football gauntlet in order to help us win our Week 17 championship games. Now, again, throughout the video, we'll be talking about players that are considered hidden gems, players that are often either not started or not even rostered in a wide majority of leagues. I'll give you guys some perspective and opinions and the statistics that justify my reasoning as to why I want to go ahead and give some of these players a chance if in fact you are in need of their services. Now, again, in order to do so and in order to find these 6 hidden gems, we're going to be using the help of Underdog Fantasy, a superhero in their own right. If you guys haven't checked out Underdog Fantasy, go ahead and do so today. Down in the description of the video. Again, it's a new year, so why not go ahead and extend your fantasy season via Underdog Fantasy, whether it is best ball draft, weekend battle royales where you can draft a team and play against thousands. Again, the pick'em slips, which we'll be going ahead and putting together a couple of them later today. If you can go ahead and put together a 5-leg pick'em slip and accurately predict on all 5 of them, you can go ahead and 20 times your overall money. Go ahead and check that out today down in the description of the video and use promo code Andrew. Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit if you sign up today using that code. Thank you very much. All right, now the objective for today's video, like I mentioned, is to go ahead and talk about players that often aren't even rostered in many leagues, and that's where we begin with Jarett Patterson, running back of the Washington football team, a running back that is currently only rostered in 19% of leagues on Yahoo formats. Now, the reason why I wanted to go ahead and first and foremost mention him is because Antonio Gibson will not be playing this weekend. And as we all know, J.D. McKissic is also on the injured reserve. So where does that leave this backfield, and where does it leave the opportunity of a backfield in which they give their respective running backs a lot of touches? In fact, let's just talk about since Week 10, how many touches Antonio Gibson by himself has received. Since Week 10, 26, 19, 36, 28. Then he played against Dallas. Unfortunately, that game went out of hand. Then played against Philadelphia, where he had 21 touches. And then he played against Dallas again this last week. Was luckily able to score a touchdown, but in those Dallas games, the running attack for the Washington football team is just completely dissolved. And obviously, the opportunity for an Antonio Gibson diminished. But going into this upcoming weekend's matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, a division rival, the last time these two teams played against each other, of course, the Philadelphia Eagles dominated, but let's not assume that's something that is going to repeat itself this week, because the last time these two teams faced each other, the Washington football team had their 3rd string quarterback playing. They didn't have Taylor Heineke. They didn't have Kyle Allen. And going into this upcoming week, they will have their services, which will boost the overall potential of this offense. Now, going into this week, I have a lot of confidence in the starting running back, specifically Jarett Patterson of the Washington football team, because of the opportunities that we saw Antonio Gibson get. A lot of them had to do with the receiving game. This guy was catching the ball 6, 5, 4 times in a singular game, and in a half PPR, full PPR scoring format. That's the major thing that we want to see from our respective running backs that increase their overall baseline of value and gives us more confidence in going ahead and starting them. So thankfully, Jarett Patterson will have majority of that opportunity and will be able to take advantage of it against the matchup. In my opinion, he should be able to score at least 1 touchdown and get himself to that 10-point range. That is why we have this week's Power Stone as Jarett Patterson. Hardest choices require the strongest of wills, and I believe Jarett Patterson is exactly that. Moving on, we have the Space Stone in the form of Marquez Callaway. Now, the wide receiver of the New Orleans Saints has benefited from a multitude of variables going out in this weekend's game against the Carolina Panthers. Now, the one positive in terms of a player actually playing this upcoming weekend is his quarterback, Taysom Hill. Instead of having, of course, Ian Book, who was just terrible last Monday night against the Miami Dolphins, we at least will have more of a structured quarterback and offense for the New Orleans Saints. So let's talk about what's going to be missing this upcoming week for the New Orleans Saints. Tre'Quan Smith is going to be out. And why does that play such a big value in terms of helping the overall value of a Marquez Callaway? Well, it's mainly because Marquez Callaway has been the number 1 wide receiver this offense. He's played 15 games this season, and he's had himself 73 targets, 40 catches, 601 receiving yards, and 6 receiving touchdowns. He has led the New Orleans Saints in all 4 of those categories. And the reason why Tre'Quan Smith's absence is going to play a big deal is because since Taysom Hill took the starting role of this offense, in terms of total targets, Marquez Callaway has led with 17, but the second highest was Tre'Quan Smith with 13. So if your number 2 overall wide receiver in your respective offense is missing, then by all means, there should be more targets available for Marquez Callaway. Callaway. Now, not only that, the Carolina Panthers in their secondary is going to be decimated this week as we see 3 of their starting cornerbacks over the last month of the season missing here. Stephon Gilmore, surprisingly, is out this week. Of course, we know AJ Boye, he's missed the last couple weeks, and Dante Jackson was placed on the injured reserve a couple weeks back as well. Those are their 3-star cornerbacks. That is really what's made the Carolina Panthers secondary what it has been all season long. And I know Jeremy Chin sitting in the secondary, they have CJ Henderson, they have some value there, but it's not going to be enough, in my opinion, to stop a Marquez Callaway-esque wide receiver. I mean, CJ Henderson by himself, in terms of grades over all cornerbacks in the National Football League, he's in the bottom 10 according to Pro Football Focus. I mean, last time we saw Marquez Callaway and Taysom Hill combined in a singular game, it was that Tampa Bay matchup in which Marquez Callaway had himself 6 catches on 9 targets for 112 receiving yards and 14.2 fantasy points. A receiver only rostered in 26% of leagues should be looked at once again as a space zone this week. Moving on to Van Jefferson. And the reality of the situation and the ether for this week is that Van Jefferson has himself an incredible matchup. He takes on the Baltimore Ravens. And the reason why I wanted to mention Van Jefferson currently only being started in 34% of leagues is, yes, of all the wide receivers that I didn't mention on this past Wednesday's wide receiver episode, Van Jefferson, in my opinion, has kind of gained more and more value as the weeks progressed. Of course, this Baltimore Ravens secondary has been hurting. I mean, the entire team has been hurting all season long with the amount of injuries that they've had to face. But Marlon Humphrey's going down, along with Anthony Averett as of late, just means complete disaster for this secondary. There's a reason why Joe Burrow was able to throw for 525 yards, 4 passing touchdowns, and along with, T. Higgins getting himself 192 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. We saw 125 from Jamar Chase. We saw 80 plus from Tyler Boyd. We saw so much value from the wide receiver position against the Baltimore Ravens secondary. In my opinion, the reality of the situation looks like Matthew Stafford, along with Cooper Kupp, OBJ, and Van Jefferson should be able to take advantage of this incredible matchup this upcoming week, despite the fact that they have a long road trip all the way to Baltimore and play a very early game. It still seems to me like this is going to be a matchup in which Van Jefferson should be able to succeed. Of all the wide receivers in this offense, he's of course known as the deep threat. He's the guy that could take the top off the defense and in one singular play make up an entire fantasy week. In one play could go 60 yards for a touchdown, 13 fantasy points, boom, his week is over, and we've pretty much cashed in on his overall value. And that's what we're hoping is going to be the case. More than just it being on Van Jefferson by himself, it's really going to be a game of whether or not Matthew Stafford could step up to the plate and deliver. I mean, in those past weeks where we saw Matthew Stafford deliver performances of 3 or more touchdowns, of course, every single one of these wide receivers in this offense, whether it was Kupp, OBJ, and Van Jefferson, were scoring on a weekly basis. So if we can get into a scenario in which Van Jefferson is given the opportunity and Matthew Stafford steps up against the easiest matchup at the quarterback position and one of the easiest matchups at the wide receiver position, I think Van Jefferson should be an incredible play this week. Moving on, we have A.J. Dillon as a time stone. Now, of all the players that I've mentioned thus far, I think A.J. Dillon, of course, is probably started amongst most of us who are in our championship games or perhaps third place games, or perhaps you play in week 17 to try to advance to your week 18 championship. But I think A.J. Dillon specifically should be looked at and paid attention to based on the entire scenario that we're kind of trending into for Sunday Night Football. Green Bay Packers taking on the Minnesota Vikings. Reddit, run from it. Destiny arrives all the same. And going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, of course, Kirk Cousins will not be under center for the Minnesota Vikings. So where does that leave the potential of the Green Bay Packers offense and their respective defense? I think A.J. Dillon is in a fantastic position. Last time we saw him in a game in which, of course, the respective defense had to come to Green Bay and go ahead and compete against them in a weather game, A.J. Dillon dominated, and the picture to our left is exactly that performance against the Tennessee Titans last year in 2020. If you guys don't remember, in that performance, of course, Aaron Jones was active, had himself 11.8 fantasy points, was averaging 9.4 yards per carry in that game, yet A.J. Dillon dominated with 21 carries, 124 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns for 25.4 total half PPR fantasy points. We've seen A.J. Dillon dominate in his rookie year. We've seen him, of course, dominate this year in the absence of Aaron Jones. And even when Aaron Jones has been active, we have seen him have some great performances. And the fact that there is no Kirk Cousins means that offense is going to be struggling. It is going to be a cold game. It is going to be tough to move the ball. And if, in fact, the Green Bay Packers could force a lot of turnovers and force a lot of 3-and-out scenarios, by all means, A.J. Dillon should be running this ball in the second half, mainly because of how well running backs have performed against this defense. As of late, Sony Michel, 131 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown last week against Minnesota. The week prior, we saw David Montgomery, 60 rushing yards, had himself 5 catches for 23. We saw Najee Harris go for 91 rushing yards and a touchdown, 3 catches, 10 yards, and a receiving touchdown. Elijah Mitchell, about a month ago, 133 rushing yards and a touchdown, 5 catches for 35. Running backs have dominated against this defense. I don't see why A.J. Dillon wouldn't be capable of doing the same in this great matchup as this week's time stone. Moving on. We have Boston Scott as the Soul Stone. Now, of course, we talk about sacrifice in regards to the Soul Stone. And of course, with Miles Sanders breaking his hand, and it looks like Jordan Howard is going to be a game time decision, of course, dealing with a stinger, there may be a chance that Jordan Howard even suits up. But even if he does, maybe he doesn't even play more than Kenneth Gainwell. And Boston Scott leads this backfield. A player that is only rostered in 30% of leagues should be looked at a little bit more because of the opportunity he has been given and how well this Philadelphia Eagles rushing attack has been since, midway through the season. I mean, going back to the Detroit Lions game, of course, Boston Scott put up 18 fantasy points. The week after that, against the Los Angeles Chargers, he played second fiddle to Jordan Howard, who scored those rushing touchdowns. Unfortunately, Boston Scott only put up 4 points. The week after, 11.5 against Denver. The week after that, we had Miles Sanders return, and that was the end of Boston Scott. Then most recently, he played both games against the New York Giants, put up 12.2 and 10.1. When he's been given opportunity, he's pretty much 10 points automatic in a half PPR scoring format, and we all know they love to use him in the receiving game as their respective receiving third down back when Kenneth Gainwell isn't available. I think Boston Scott's in a fantastic position going into this upcoming week. And if, in fact, we do not see Jordan Howard starting this upcoming Sunday, I think automatically Boston Scott is a top 24 respective running back in fantasy. And we'll, of course, rank him as such tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Do not forget, we live stream every Sunday morning. And that is why I believe he's a perfect hidden gem for this week. Moving on to our final hidden gem for the week, we have our Mind Stone. Cursed with knowledge, I believe that the Green Bay Packers defense is going to be an incredible play. A defense that is currently rostered in 60% of leagues, if in fact, somehow, some way, because I do mention defenses throughout our waiver wire episode, and somehow, some way, people come out and say, hey, Andrew, and they'll either message me down in the comments, Twitter, Patreon, my Discord server, and they'll say, hey, I still have this defense available. Should I play them? And if there's a possibility where you don't have one of those top tier defenses like Dallas or Tampa Bay, I think the Green Bay Packers defense against a team that does not have Kirk Cousins under center is a pretty good position to be in. I mean, in 4 out of the last 6 weeks, the Green Bay Packers defense has put up 13 or more fantasy points. I mean, that's 4 out of the last 6 weeks. In those 2 games in which they really didn't put up many points, one was against Minnesota, and of course, Kirk Cousins put up a great number, and the other was against the Baltimore Ravens, in which they really couldn't stop a mobile quarterback. But taking on Sean Mannion this week, I mean, what is Mannion going to be able to do against them? I don't really think he's capable of much. I mean, the last time this quarterback started for the Minnesota Vikings, it was in week 17 of the 2019 season. They took on the Chicago Bears, and Mannion had negative 0.96 fantasy points in that singular game. There's a lot of potential in which, in my opinion, we could see this Green Bay Packers defense, like they did last week to Baker Mayfield, cause a lot of turnovers, 4 interceptions to be exact, and that's what the picture is on screen. And of course, get after the quarterback and cause havoc. I think the Green Bay Packers defense, a great overall play. And I think one of the only, I think maybe I've mentioned defenses maybe a handful of times this season via Hidden Gems. This is one of the only ones that I'm super confident about, and I'm trusting their overall potential this week. All right, now that we've covered our hidden gems thanks to Underdog Fantasy, we're going to go ahead and travel to UnderdogFantasy.com. And of course, if you have not yet already, use promo code Andrew today. If you do so, when signing up, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100. Put together a couple pick'em slips and get ourselves into a successful momentum like we did last week, in which we were able to successfully predict a bunch of those pick'ems. Hopefully we'll be able to do the same this week. Let's check that out right now. Okay, so as you can see here, we are UnderdogFantasy.com. For those of you who are not familiar with the pick'ems game, if you are able to go ahead and put together 2, 3, 4, or 5 correct pick'ems in terms of picking over under on a given statistic. For example, Joe Burrow, 282.5 passing yards. If he's able to go over that number, which would be 283 or more, or lower, which would be 282 or below, then you can go ahead, predict over under, and if you succeed by doing so, 2 predictions correct, 3 times your money. 3 predictions correct 6 times, 4 for 10, and 5 for 20 times your overall money. We're going to try to put together our best pick'em slips as I've kind of curated the entire list and found what I am most confident in going into this upcoming weekend. Let's go ahead and begin with David Montgomery in terms of receiving yards, 22.5. The stat that I specifically wanted to mention. In the last 5 games, the receiving contributions of David Montgomery have been unbelievable. Specifically, 9 total targets, 7 catches, 61. Followed by 6 total targets, 5 catches, 23. 7 for 6 receptions, 39 receiving yards. 9 targets, 8 catches, 51. 3 targets, 3 catches, 28. So specifically, in the last 5 weeks, Not only has he been catching the ball more than any other running back in the National Football League, of course, if Leonard Fournette was still healthy, he would be competing with him, but he's catching the ball more than any other back in the National Football League as of late. In terms of getting an ample amount of targets, it is certainly there. But not only that, he's been able to accomplish this number of 22.5 receiving yards in each of the last 5 games. So why not go ahead and take the over there? I think that's probably one of the more automatic plays of the week. And that's what I'm probably going to put every pick 'em slip with, because I, of course, want to get to, 2 or 3 times, maybe even putting together a 5-leg, overall slip. But I want to have a base player that I am most confident in. And of all the players I looked at, that's probably one of them. Now, I typically like to go over on a lot of players, but specifically the one that this week caught my eye was Ezekiel Elliott and his overall rushing yards. Unfortunately, Ezekiel Elliott hasn't been the most efficient back. In fact, 53.5 rushing yards has been something of a plague for him. He hasn't been able to accomplish that number in the last 9 consecutive games. In fact, in the last 9 consecutive games, these are his rushing totals: 50, 51, 41, 32, 25, 45, 45, 52, and 37. I will take the under here, as I anticipate this team to throw the ball heavily against the Arizona Cardinals and find their majority of their success in doing that. We'll take Ezekiel Elliott on the under. Now, in terms of going back up on the list, another thing that caught my eye is Gerald Everett, 28.5 receiving yards. This is a man that in the last 2 weeks alone has gotten himself 60 receiving yards and 68 receiving yards. Of course, he's becoming more and more of a prospect in this offense, and as long as Russell Wilson continues to trust in him, he's getting just as many targets as Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf in the last couple games. And in my opinion, this is another one we could potentially take the over and confidently play. Now, as we continue to roll up, I think DeAndre Swift is another one that if we want to go ahead and put together a 5-leg parlay, 76.5 total rushing and receiving yards is extremely accomplishable, because, the thing that we mainly know is that Motor City Dan Campbell, the head coach of the Detroit Lions, he's going to be the acting offensive coordinator. And the last time we saw him as the acting offensive coordinator calling plays was the last time DeAndre Swift was active. It was in those games against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and it was in those games against the Cleveland Browns where they went off in terms of running the ball consistently, and DeAndre Swift went off accordingly. In those last 2 games that he performed, 136 rushing yards and 130 rushing yards. So why not go ahead, take DeAndre Swift on the over against the Seattle Seahawks, who are giving up a lot of points to opposing running backs this season already. I think there's a very good chance in which DeAndre Swift is able to accomplish this, not only on the ground, but through the air. Those combined yards are an automatic in my eyes. Now, of course, we can continue to scroll up here and find a lot of value. Perhaps Javonte Williams, with so many players out for the Denver Broncos, could have himself an opportunity against the defense like the Los Angeles Chargers, who gave up a bunch of yards to Rex Burkhead. But as we continue to scroll up, another one that caught my eye as I was kind of sifting through this is Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles, who takes on the Washington Football Team. And the reason why I have a lot of confidence in Dallas Goedert is because in 2 out of his last 3 games, he has surpassed over 100 receiving yards. The last time he played against the Washington Football Team, he had 135 receiving yards. Last week, the Dallas Cowboys took on Washington, and of course, Dalton Schultz had himself an incredible game in which he was able to get over 80 receiving yards against that defense. So why not go ahead? 54.5 receiving yards. I think this is very accomplishable for a Dallas Goedert-esque wide receiver against the Washington Football Team. If in fact, there's no Miles Sanders, there is no Jordan Howard, it may not be as easy to run the ball with Boston Scott. I expect him to play well for sure, because he will have goal line opportunities, but I think majority of the passing game will be going in the direction of Dallas Goedert, which should be an accomplishable number. Now, outside of that, the next thing that I want to go ahead and throw out is I want to find the matchup between the Indianapolis Colts and, of course, the Las Vegas Raiders. Earlier today, Carson Wentz has been activated. He will be starting tomorrow. That automatically makes me want to take the over here. So if I continue to scroll up, I currently have 5 overall players that I have secured. The one that I'm going to go ahead and drop off is Gerald Everett. I'll go ahead and put him in a pick'em slip, but I think if I'm going to find something that I'm more confident in, I will take over total rushing and receiving yards from Jonathan Taylor over 121. That, in my opinion, that's a number that I'm willing to take. And as we continue to scroll up to the top here, I think, as you can see behind me, this is probably, let me go ahead and move that. These players are probably, in my opinion, the best suited for their overall matchups. Of course, on the very top, David Montgomery, then followed by Ezekiel Elliott, under DeAndre Swift, Dallas Goedert, and Jonathan Taylor over. This is a 5-leg slip. And if I go ahead and make a $10 overall wager here, I get 20 times my overall money. We're going to go ahead and give this a shot. Now, of course, there are some scenarios in which I want to go ahead and break that up in specifically, I want to go ahead and take the receiving yards of a David Montgomery. I want to go ahead and just attach him to Dallas Goedert and just leave that as such. And just go ahead and ride this out this upcoming weekend. And just put a $5 bet on it and try to 3 times my overall money. Because the chances of me going ahead and hitting that 5 legs slip is extremely rare. But I'm pretty confident based on what we've seen over the last couple weeks that those players will be able to do so. But I can always go ahead and put together smaller slips and just try to cash in instead of taking such a big risk later down the line. Now, earlier this week, I did put together a couple pick'em slips, and I want to show you guys what I've put together, respectively. Now, at the beginning of the week, obviously the lines for the pick'em slips are a little different, but I went ahead and I grabbed immediately at the beginning of the week Jonathan Taylor over on the total, and we continue to do that today. I took the over on David Montgomery rushing yards because I had a feeling that Justin Fields wasn't going to play, and if that was going to be the case, obviously that would potentially help David Montgomery. And I took the under on Jarett Patterson on Tuesday when I made that running back video. I think I took this overall wager, and I thought to myself, well, Jarett Patterson hasn't been more than only a couple yards in the last couple weeks. So why do they think he can potentially put up over 79 total rushing and receiving yards combined? I took the under there with these two over. Another bet that I took earlier this week was a 4-leg parlay in which I put together Jarett Patterson under, Mac Jones on the over on passing yards, along with over on Stephon Diggs on receiving yards and over on Amari Cooper. I believe that Stephon Diggs number has decreased in the last couple of days, which may give us more, incentive to go ahead and potentially play that. The last one that I took earlier this week, actually that's the new one that I just put together, is Dallas Goedert over on the receiving yards, and also Mark Andrews over on the receiving yards. Tyler Huntley's most likely going to play. Even if it's Josh Johnson, I still have a lot of confidence against this upcoming week's team, the Los Angeles Rams, that Mark Andrews is going to be able to succeed regardless. But I put together a couple pick'em slips earlier this week. The last couple ones that I want to put together is via Rival. So let's go ahead and check that out right now. Okay, so as you can see to the left of me, this is the Rival section of Underdog Fantasy. You go ahead and pin 2 players against one another, and they fight over a given statistic. Obviously, some players might have an edge over another. For example, rushing yards, Patrick Mahomes versus Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow is given an additional 9 rushing yards. So Patrick Mahomes has to overcome the -9 deficit that he's currently sitting in and be able to outrun Joe Burrow. He's been a mobile quarterback and is definitely, not afraid of running the ball when he has been given the opportune time to do so. In the other end, of course, we've seen Joe Burrow also run the ball when in fact he needs to do so and get himself first down with his legs. And especially against a secondary like the Kansas City Chiefs, it may be difficult for him to find open wide receivers, might have to run more. That is something that obviously is difficult to predict. But the one that I continue to kind of look at as I've kind of scrolled through the list begins with number 1, Marquez Callaway, receiving yards against Robbie Anderson. There was no advantage on either side. It is just a straight up matchup. And I think, obviously, like we've mentioned, via, going after our hidden gems prospect, I think Marquez Callaway, in terms of getting more receiving yards than Robbie Anderson, I'll take that, especially considering we have Sam Darnold back as the starting quarterback of the Carolina Panthers. That really hasn't bode well for Robbie Anderson this season at all. The next one that I really liked was DeAndre Swift against Russell Wilson in terms of total rushing yards. For somehow, some way, they think that Russell Wilson's a mobile quarterback. Absolutely not. He does not want to run the ball. He does not want to put himself in danger, and he has not been, the level that he has been earlier in his career. He takes on DeAndre Swift in total rushing yards, and like I mentioned, I really do think Swift is going to be able to light it up on the ground. Even with Russell Wilson getting a 38-yard advantage, I don't think he'll be able to run for 20 yards, much less, which, at that point, even if he does run for 20 yards, that's 58 yards for Russell Wilson. We don't think DeAndre Swift against Seattle can't run for more than 60 yards. I think he'll be able to do so. That's another pick'em that I've continued to kind of go after. Another one that I found quite interesting was Ramondre Stevenson against Ogunbowale. Now, the reason why they have Ramondre Stevenson here instead of Damian Harris is that Damian Harris is questionable to play. And if he doesn't end up playing, this is one that I would automatically smash. I would honestly think that Ramondre Stevenson, as the lead back of this team, should be able to succeed. Just wanted to throw that out there. Of course, we don't know if Mike Evans is going to play. If he does, sure, I would take him over on receiving yards against the Braxton Berrios, but I don't know if he's going to for sure play. I really do like Ronald Jones against Michael Carter in terms of total rushing yards. It is most definitely the easiest matchup at the running back position outside of the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Michael Carter has to go against one of the toughest run-stop defenses in the National Football League. This is a nice 3-leg wager that I'd like to put together. Go ahead, put $10 on this, try to 6 times my overall money in terms of taking Callaway, DeAndre Swift, and Ronald Jones this week. I'll submit that. And that's pretty much it, guys. So go ahead and check out Underdog Fantasy today. There's a link down in the description of the video, whether it is the NHL, the NBA, the NFL, college football, there are a bunch of pick'ems and rivals games that you can play. Not only that, you can go ahead and play best ball leagues for the NFL playoffs. If we go ahead and travel to the main menu here, there is even a contest called the Gauntlet. And if that reminds you of anybody, I'm trying to help you guys out. Play the Gauntlet. I'm telling you, yes, it's a $25 buy-in, but holy moly, you go ahead and you draft against, a bunch of entries. And the entire purpose is to try to get that first place of $200,000. If you're able to predict and draft the most successful team for the NFL playoffs, you can get yourself a nice way to start the 2022 year. Either way, check it out. Check out Underdog Fantasy. Perhaps play in their Sunday Battle Royale where it's a $5 entry. You can draft as many teams as you'd like. Draft players that you think are going to succeed and try to put up the most overall points. A lot of fun to be had here. Outside of that, we're going to travel back to, of course, finding the Fantasy Football Gauntlet, reassembling that, and snapping our lineups back to success. Thank you very much. Again, thank you everybody for watching. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, I'll be live streaming here on the channel, answering all your questions with updated rankings on screen. Until tomorrow, thank you everybody. Again, Marquez Callaway, Green Bay Packers defense, AJ Dillon, Boston Scott, Jarett Patterson, and Van Jefferson. Those are our hidden gems for this week. Good luck, everybody, and I'll see you guys tomorrow. Peace.